This is big. The Department of Labor recently announced a long-anticipated change to the rule defining whether a worker is considered an independent contractor or not. You might not be an independent contractor, but this certainly affects a large number of employees in the workforce. The new rule is titled the Employee or Independent Contractor Status under Federal Labor Standards Act, Family and Medical Leave Act, and Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act, or as it's more commonly known by its acronym, EACTFLSAFLSAFL Act. And today, we thought we'd explore what the prior rule was, how the new rule will change things for workers, employees, and how we do employment classification analyses in light of it. Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the TV show that's misclassified as a podcast. I'm your everyman host, Brent Buckwright, here with two experts who knew about big data before it was big, Doctors Nathan Woods and Steve Bronars. Nathan, Steve, how are you?
I am great. Thank you, Brent.
Doing great, Brent. Thank you.
So before we get into all the details about the actual rule itself, I feel like I've got a vague conception about what an independent contractor is. But Nathan, would you mind kind of laying the ground on why this matters, what we're really talking about, what's going on here?
Sure. Yeah. And I think Steve said earlier that he'd actually researched prior to this podcast. So I think he's going to be even more chock full of detail than usual. Just at a high level, I think to start, especially for people that are not dealing with this every day at work, independent contractor classification is important. If you are an employee, you have certain protections guaranteed by law under the FLSA, overtime after 40 hours in a work week, minimum wage laws, that sort of thing. And if you are not subject to those employee protections, and whatever contract you work out with that company is what they are obligated to do for you. So people care a lot about it, and how you figure out whether or not you are an employee or not. There's a lot of details, and we're going to get into a lot of those details, and people can argue about those details. But I think what everybody kind of agrees is kind of at the top end. It's trying to assess how economically dependent that independent contractor or potential employee is upon the company or the potential employer that is working with them and asking them to do the work. So at a high level, it's all about that economic dependence. And then where everybody, I think, disagrees, and there's a lot of been changes over time and everything else, is how do you figure out whether or not somebody's economically dependent on that company or not?
Well, Nathan, I don't know if you can see Steve. He looks positively ready to explode with facts and details. Steve, what was the prior rule broadly, and then what has really changed now?
Yeah, even before we get into the prior rule, it's important to know that there have been a series of rules that have changed a little bit over time. But as Nathan says, this economic dependence, or sometimes called economic reality of the situation, and this proposed rule in the comment period is open until April 28th. So it's not a final rule yet.
So get your comments in now.
Get your comments in now. And then they'll come up with a final rule after that, and it will take effect at some date to be specified in that final rule. But it is superseding a 2024 rule. But really, there was a rule before that in the first Trump administration, which actually didn't take effect till 2021, that it's very, very similar to. And so in the prior rule, there were really 6 different core factors for this economic dependence or economic reality. How much control and the nature and the degree of the control that the worker has. We want to be careful calling him a worker because they may be an employee, they may be an independent contractor. And that's over things like scheduling.
But they're definitely working.
They're definitely working. It could be scheduling, supervision, setting the price, and the ability to work for others for some of the things that are mentioned. So that control, the opportunity for profit or loss is an important thing. The degree of the permanence of the relationship and the skills and initiative or two other different things that were factors that were considered investments by the worker and the employer, who's investing more in the equipment, in the human capital. And then finally, the extent to which the work performed by this worker is an integral part of their potential employers, the person hiring them or the entity hiring them's business. So how related that work is to the core of what the business is doing. So there are those 6 things. And that's in the old rule. And the new rule
Well, before we get
doesn't
into the new rule,
discount them, but just puts more weight on certain of those factors.
for the opportunity for a profit and loss, that doesn't mean you have to make a profit. You could just take losses the entire time. Like, what if
Yeah, I
you're a
think
really
that-
bad independent contractor, I
Yeah.
guess?
I think that this is a really good time to introduce this. We're talking about, even though you mentioned 3 different acts, we're really talking about the FLSA, generally speaking, for practical purposes. That is the key thing. So the IRS might have a different point of view about whether this is a business of yours, especially if you're taking perpetual losses. They could consider it a hobby, right? If you're not showing revenues. I think the important thing here is that we're talking about the FLSA and primarily, and there may be other situations that your business might be in where it could be questioned by the government, or there could be state rules that these same factors wouldn't have applied to based on the 2024 rule. We're not lawyers, but these are the federal Fair Labor Standards Act guidelines for that, not for what the IRS might view or other agencies might view what's a legitimate business or not.
The other rule in there that sounded pretty interesting to me was the rule that you can't be doing an important enough contribution to the employer's business, that you need to be almost an accessory to whatever that main process is. What is that rule trying to say? Like that to me, it feels like it's trying to get at some hard to describe feature of being an employer.
I think the point is, if your business is cutting people's hair or, mowing lawns for people or whatever, and you hire people to do that work, it's going to be questioned more. Because the more they're doing an integral part of your work, the more that leans towards them being an employee in the eyes of the FLSA than being an independent contractor. But I think the other point I would make is that none of these are necessarily a bright line, yes or no. There's ranges of possibilities for all these things, whether it's the opportunity for profit or loss, or whether it's control, or how integral your work is. Presumably, everybody's work is pretty integral to it. I think that it's a judgment. That evidence has to be weighed, and it's one of the factors that would be taken into account according to the 2024 rule.
So what is the new rule, or should I say the old rule? What's going on there?
In the latest version of the rule, which is a callback to the one that was in place for a few years before the 2024 rule.
They're always making these reboots. They're just bringing back the old material.
Yes, it is. We can get into some of the reasons for that, but it really elevates 2. And it says the opportunity for profit and loss and control are the most important core factors for this economic dependence that Nathan was talking about. And it clarifies, like it did in 2021, that some things that look like you're exerting control over the entity or person that you have a contract with is due to safety or other legal regulation. So you want to make sure a risk, the factors that's why you're trying to control what they're doing, and how they're doing it, and maybe even when they're doing it. But you'd have to make that argument that it was those business reasons that you were doing that wasn't control, like some other scheduling and other controls that might make it look like it's more of an employer-employee relationship. And the other factors are still mentioned, but it's kind of suggested that they wouldn't supersede if the two core ones were all leaning in one direction, whether employee or whether independent contractor. And so I'm not sure how much weight those other factors would get, but they're mentioned, but they're somewhat given less weight. Maybe if it was a close call on the first two core ones, you would use some of these other factors to reach a determination, because it's either you're an employee or you're not. It's not like you can pick a middle point.
It's interesting because one of the things that's different, I think, and this will be my turn to say I'm not an attorney, but relative to the last round of this, is that I think those 6 factors that we had previously, there was not really any guidance about which are more important or what weighting to put on any of them. And so it's a little less clear. And here it's explicitly, these 2 things are elevated above everything else. And I think they even say, we'd be surprised if the other factors didn't kind of trail in the same direction or point in the same direction as those 2.
Right.
So start with those 2 and everything else kind of falls into place, I think, is the tone.
And the way that the rule is being proposed and was before was these issues are difficult, and it's costly for businesses to get this wrong, and to really figure out how they should do it if they want to abide by the law. So they're trying to simplify it, is part of the reason that they're giving. Whereas I think in the 2024 rule, it was like, hey, and I think there are pros and cons, clearly, of being either an employee or an independent contractor. It's not one size fits all. But the emphasis was on, we think that workers are not being afforded the same kind of protections if they were treated as employees. And so I think the emphasis was more on, we think we'd be helping out these workers if it when in doubt they were treated as employees, as opposed to, let's make it simpler for businesses to comply with the regulations, which is kind of the tone of the way the rule is written for the 2026 rule, and probably the way it was written in 2021.
So I want to get into some of the implications of this change, because it, to me, seems like you could have a world where if these contractors aren't doing work that is essential to the operation of the company's product or process, whatever, you could have a lot of different kinds of contractors that you're employing that may or may not be now affected by the change. How do you guys make sense of what the landscape looks like for an employer trying to manage this change?
Well, I would lead off by saying, let's not assume it's going to be permanent, because we've seen enough opinion letters by the DOL and rules and it could be executive orders and all these other kind of things, because it's not really a change in the law. It's a change in how the law is going to be applied and it's been, that's been, the Secretary of Labor and the Department of Labor have the authority to set this. So my first advice would be, you want to be reasonable going forward, because the way you're doing things, it may not last if there's another change in the rules. I think it's interesting that certain of these factors, like, let's say, the skills and initiative of the workers, those things are like, what units is that measured in? How would you demonstrate that? But the idea was kind of like, well, if you're not that skilled of a worker, you're probably more likely to be an employee than having your own business that you're operating as an independent contractor. And while that may make some logical sense, I think it's probably a relief for employers not to worry too much about that, to have other factors that they really focus on. So I think that, the way to do it is really take seriously these core opportunity for profit loss and the amount of control that you're exercising over this contractor. The real litigation risk is that you're treating someone as an independent contractor, and later it's determined in a court that they should have been treated as a worker. That is really what you need to be concerned about. And so I think that's the thing to focus on going forward. And I think it's probably always been what the businesses have been focused on.
Well, and I think what challenge that companies have, and you can contrast this with other kinds of misclassification, exempt, non-exempt determinations, where the folks at issue are employees of the company, and the company has a lot of data on what it is that they're doing, and presumably can demonstrate as best they can what they're doing to make whatever case they want to make. I think the challenge for the independent contractor kinds of litigations is that because they are not employees, or the company is not treating them, the worker, as an employee, the company is not keeping track of all of the data. We have engagements where they don't even really know how to contact all of the people that are potentially going to be a part of a lawsuit because they never were employed. So they don't have contact information for them that will be reliable, and they may not know exactly what they were doing day to day. And of course, I think those companies would like to say that's pretty good evidence that they must be independent contractors because we didn't have control of them, and you don't even know how to track them down at their home address. But that may or may not work. But I think that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge now. I don't know that there's any different challenge going forward. I think it's kind of an interesting idea that I don't know what their attorneys would advise, but boy, if you had the data to demonstrate that person really was properly classified as an independent contractor because they really were, incentivized to take risks and invest in their own tools to get their job done more efficiently, to make more money, to accept or to turn down work if they wanted to do it at whatever time of day they wanted to, and outside the control, all of the things that are kind of embedded in those two big topics. That would be great to be able to make that case, it seems to me. But on the other hand, if you're gathering that data, maybe you're looking more like an employer at that point. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there's for those factors, I think that's definitely true. There's another one that is being de-emphasized, which is the degree of permanence of the relationship. And I don't even know what kind of data that it may make some common sense that the more permanent the relationship, the more likely you are to be an employee. But there's plenty of instances where employees turn over, and instances where you're using the same independent contractor to do the same type of work for you. So again, it's not obvious what it would take to pass or fail each of these things. And so it's probably a relief for employers to focus on fewer of them and have a better understanding of what it would take to comply with the law. But like I said, you never know. These rules could change, with the new administration. And so it's definitely a situation where you have to be prepared for changes in the regulatory landscape.
So we do these misclassification type analyses all the time. And I know, as you all have pointed out, it's not as if when you're doing an analysis or either legal or economic, you're running through a checklist and saying, I've crossed some threshold. There's some clear line here. Is there any ways that you think the way that you would analyze this data is going to change with the rule? Or are there any other ways that you might have to conceptualize the information you're requesting? What goes on differently on our end is what I'm asking.
I think it's an interesting question. I think Steve's right. If people can focus their attention on fewer elements, that probably clarifies where we need to spend our time looking economically, analytically. I think the lawyers many times have more to say about some of those different elements than we might, because the data may just not be available to answer the question one way or the other. So the more elements, the more likely that we won't have something to say on one of them. I think it's really going to depend on if companies change the information that they gather in response to these rules, whether it's this rule change or the rule change that you might anticipate in another couple of years, or the one 4 years after that, whatever it might be. If companies are changing the data that they gather related to any one of these topics, then I think those would be the places where we as analysts of data would be focusing our attention. I think the attorneys have to look at all of it and make their legal arguments, based on the papers, regardless.
And you said you were an attorney, is that correct?
Yes, I did take a practice LSAT. That's true.
And you did
But
say at a
not
Holiday Inn
recently.
Express. Yeah, not recently. Yeah.
Do you guys have any opinions about the class implications of this? Kind of going back to the example I presented earlier of an employer has a lot of different kinds of contractors, and some of them might be more subject to the rule than others.
And I agree with that. And even if you have them doing the same tasks, they could have been doing it for different amounts of times in different ways and taking advantage of opportunities or not taking advantage of opportunities that would be more of an indicator that it was a business that they were operating and that they really are independent contractors, not workers. But other workers alongside them may not exhibit the same kind of behaviors that would show up in the data that would lead to that. But as long as they have the opportunity to do that, that's a key phrase in all this, regardless of the rules, the opportunity for profit or loss. And your risk aversion or where you are in your career will determine that you might behave differently when faced with these kind of opportunities. And so I think it's very important, both for the merits and kind of the class certification, that it's not necessarily the case that every one of your independent contractors, even for doing the same kind of work for your business, will exhibit the same kind of pattern of work behaviors and other things that you're tracking that would allow you to analyze this in more detail. So I think that's a very important part of this.
And just as an example, you might have one of those contractors, one of those workers, independent contractors, really is doing all of their work for the one company. And that work could be doing that alongside another independent contractor that is only doing half of their work for that company and another half of the work for a competitor company, or another independent contractor that might have subcontractors doing the work that are actually maybe even independent contractors themselves, or maybe employed by the contractor for the original company. So all of those examples are in different circumstances, though, even though they're doing the same thing for that one company, and how these rules apply to them. And by the way, Steve, I think that's true under the current rules and
Yep.
and under the new proposed rule. It's just really hard to think about all of those people as being at least minimally comparable in the way you might if you started with, I at least know that you're all employed by this company as hourly employees. It's you may not be able to accept that premise even to begin with.
And one of the key issues in this, I think it cuts into both the profit and loss and also the control, is this ability to work for others, including your competitors, which as an employee you wouldn't do. Now, how many of the independent contractors that you might have doing in your business doing the same kind of work take advantage of that opportunity or don't? But to me as an economist, it's like, well, they have the opportunity to do that. So even if a small fraction of them did it, that doesn't mean the others didn't have that opportunity. So I would say as an economist, like whether they exercise that ability to do that or not, or they just prefer, working with the same uh, business that's hired them. It's a choice that they're making. And so I think that would be something that would be hard to determine on a class-wide basis. What were you doing when you weren't working for this business? What else were you doing? But with enough discovery, you could determine on a case-by-case basis what was happening there. And so some of these things, I think, if you think about it on a class-wide basis, might be hard to get that data. If it was a single plaintiff case, you would, be able to learn that by, exploring the records of that independent contractor that's claiming they really were an employee.
And right, the records of with the company and then with potentially whatever other entities they may have been.
Right, because it'd be a more
well.
focused discovery. Like for this particular plaintiff, who else were you working for during this period? But again, even if they didn't choose to pursue that option, it doesn't mean they didn't have it. And it's a tricky question because there's always been this concept of moonlighting, and I'm not just talking about Bruce Willis detective show or whatever that was. So I really blew that thing, but okay. So
perfect reference.
There are the BLS keeps track of people that hold multiple jobs. I don't know if they ask them in the other job, are you an independent contractor or an employee? But there are examples of this, what we call moonlighting, where people hold multiple jobs. And so it's not that if you held multiple jobs for multiple employers that you're no longer an employee of either place. But it is one of the factors that you would look at. Are you working for my competitor when you're not working for me? And how dependent are you on the work that I'm hiring you for as a contractor?
And it's been a little while since we've given our poor friends at the BLS a hard time for not just, why don't you just gather more data? Start asking these questions.
Well, they do ask people whether they're self-employed, which is their version of the independent contractor, or their employees. But what they don't ask them is, are you exempt or non-exempt from the FLSA when it comes to overtime and stuff like that? So, yeah, I think that there are a lot of issues that come up if you're going to try to analyze this on a class-wide basis, given what Nathan said on this, which is you're just lacking some of the information if they're not your employees. You're not gathering that as the business that's hired these contractors.
Well, I feel like now's as good a time as any to let y'all know that I actually moonlight. I have a second job that I do. I do data and logistics for NASCAR. And I know it's surprising because I never talk about racing at all, but I just thought,
all this time I thought you were a driver.
Yeah. They don't let me on the road anymore after the incident. Well, we are going to follow what happens with this rule when it goes into effect, and then potentially when it's changed later. Steve, what did you say was the date for submitting any objections to it?
They're comments. Could be an objection. Could be need to do even more.
Could be the transcript of this podcast.
Could be good. April 28th.
Great. Well, if you want to submit any comments to the Ixaflaflamsop Act, April 28th is your date. We will keep you informed about all the analytics around classifying contractors and everything else we do normally. Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.